hope you've had a good day so far. We now are going to welcome our keynote speaker, which is Professor Timothy Darvill. Last night we had a lecture about the Human Henge project, and after we booked Tim, he came up with this sensational discovery about the Stonehenge Calendar. And so we kind of persuaded him quite firmly to come and do the lecture today, because I had a look at it, I looked at the paper, and I was quite blown away by it, because the implications of this are quite large, especially with the Eastern Mediterranean connection, possibly an Egyptian connection, and the way it even links with some of the old myths. So I'm really delighted he's able to come and share this brand new research with Megalithomania. So please, let's give a warm welcome to Timothy Darvill.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to be back at Megalithomania after only 24 hours. Great to see it all. Great to be part of it. Yesterday we spoke about the human henge and all the things that were going on there, and I hope that was illuminating to some of you. Thank you for those who came up afterwards and made some comments and questions and enthused with me about some of your experiences. It was really great to hear that. Today we're going to change track, and as they used to say on Blue Peter, now for something completely different, and different it's going to be. I suppose you can't have a Megalithomania conference without at least one or two contributions about Stonehenge, and I don't think you can have a paper at the conference unless you mention Stonehenge. So this is going to be a little bit Stonehenge for the next hour or so. I'm very privileged, I suppose, to have been able to excavate inside Stonehenge. I've been working on Stonehenge for more than 35 years now, and in 2008 we did some excavations inside. In fact, it's a terrible admission that I think I'm the only person alive now who's directed excavations inside Stonehenge. Sadly, all those who were with us and those in earlier times are now no longer with us, which is not good. It's a site, though, which underpins so much of our understanding of prehistory, or perhaps we can spin that argument round and say that so much of our prehistory hangs on this kind of pivot of Stonehenge. If Stonehenge doesn't fit into the model, then the model's probably wrong. So goes the traditional argument. But at the same time, I think we need to use and think about Stonehenge not as something which we have to accommodate whatever, but rather a place to think about the world from. And that's, in a sense, what we're going to be talking a little bit about this afternoon. How can we use Stonehenge to think outwards? And the calendar idea is part of that thinking outwards. I should also just preface what I'm going to say by remarking that COVID's been a funny old time over the last 2 or 3 years, hasn't it? And we've heard from several speakers, and they're quite right, that it's had a detrimental impact on many people. But there are always silver linings. And I have to admit that in this case, there was a little silver lining, which was that, of course, Stonehenge was closed to visitors for a long time, 18 months, in fact. That meant that we could go and work inside Stonehenge during the day. And that was actually incredibly helpful. Up until then, the last 10 years, we've only been able to get into Stonehenge at night to do work, to do research. And that obviously has limitations. So being able to go there during the day, in part, informed what I'm going to talk about now, which is the recognition that within the structure of Stonehenge, there are some interesting phenomena which perhaps relate to an ancient calendar. But I want to go back and situate that. I'm not going to jump in with the calendar. I want to think a little bit more widely before we go there. I'd also like to just make a few presumptions, perhaps, before we start. I'm going to assume that Stonehenge is a sacred site with cosmological meaning. There are some who don't think that's the case, but I'm going to assume that that is the case. I'm also going to make the assumption that there was never a roof on Stonehenge. Again, there are people who say there was. There's absolutely no evidence that there was, but nonetheless, people have come up with ideas that there might be. And my justification for adopting that position is that the skyscape is what Stonehenge is all about. And if you put a roof on it, you'd immediately nullify Stonehenge as a structure, as a monument. So it's the wrong way around, as it were. And the third assumption is that it is a multi-period site. There is no one Stonehenge, there are a whole series of Stonehenges which happen to occupy the same place. But the monument itself changes over the course of time. And a general theory which would help us understand how Stonehenge at one period does not necessarily translate into another. These are quite specific in terms of what's going on. So those are my three kind of assumptions which underpin what I'm going to be talking about, and I'm going to do it in three movements, as they say. We'll talk a little bit about the landscape and the cosmology of Stonehenge to start with. Then we'll look at the possible calendar, which is embedded in its structure, and then we'll say a little bit about where that calendar might have come from and what it relates to and how it works on the bigger frame. But let's, as they say, start at the beginning. Let's start with the beginning of Stonehenge. But there we've got a problem, because we don't know when Stonehenge began. We know when the earthwork was first constructed, and that was around about 3000 BC, 2995, according to the latest modelling of the radiocarbon dates. But there was stuff on that site before the earthwork enclosure was built. How long before is a matter of guesstimation at the moment, but our excavations revealed material which we've radiocarbon dated, which takes us well back, perhaps another 3,000 or 4,000 years, and there's undoubtedly structures under there which no one has yet noticed, which take Stonehenge back in time as well. So don't let us assume that the monument that we see today is the first thing that occupied that site. What we see today is the culmination of a whole series of events which stretch back in time and which can be taken even further back in time through things that we don't currently see. So we have to be quite careful about what's going on here. Now, when we look at Stonehenge today, the earliest thing that we can reasonably see in the landscape or at the site is the earthwork enclosure, which I think probably most of you are familiar with. There it is. It comprises a bank and a ditch, and in this case, this is not a henge because, well, not a henge in a traditional sense, because the bank is on the inside and the ditch is on the outside, whereas the traditional definition of a henge is, of course, the other way around, a ditch on the inside and a bank on the outside. So although it's called Stonehenge, it's not a henge. It's what we would refer to these days as a formative henge. It's a henge that sets the scene for the classic henges which come later and which have a quite different kind of structure and meaning to it. It's in fact part of a tradition of monuments, nothing to do with Amesbury and all these other things. It's part of a tradition of monuments which are essentially cremation cemeteries. And within and around that enclosure there are, of course, dozens and dozens of cremation burials. They date the period from 3000 down to about 2500, and as I say, they're entirely typical of monuments of this kind. The entrance at this period points out towards the northeast, but doesn't have an astronomical alignment of any meaningful sense at this point. It's at about 44 degrees east at that time. There are some structures inside the earthwork enclosure, and these are the subject of quite a lot of discussion and debate these days. Some people suggest there may have been stones standing in the so-called Aubrey holes around it. There's absolutely no evidence for that at all. And in fact, there's quite a lot of evidence that they never had stones in, including scientific studies of the compaction of the deposits in the bottom of the holes. Some people say they had wooden stakes or wooden posts in them, and that is possible, but again, the same sorts of argument apply. All we can say is that there were pits, and that in those pits there is a certain amount of cultural material, including a lot of cremation burials. Most of those pits look to have been recut, and a very detailed study that was done by Karen Walker back in the mid-1990s showed how that sequence of recutting worked with reference to these holes, the Aubrey holes, around the edge. So we have to be very careful about that. We also have to be a little bit careful of these so-called barrow sites. They're not barrows, that's what they're called. The North Barrow is particularly interesting, as it's certainly possible that the North Barrow is sitting here before that earthwork enclosure is built. So the North Barrow may be part of an earlier structure which is, in a sense, giving rise to what we say is the Northern Barrow, but it is earlier than the enclosure. That needs to be tested, but it's certainly a strong possibility in what goes on. There is also a whole series of pits and things in the middle. They're not on this particular picture, but you probably visualize them from other places. Sometimes people put posts in those holes, and some of them may indeed have been post holes. But we excavated 2 in 2008, and neither of them were post holes. That's not to say some of the others weren't post holes, but of the ones we looked at, they weren't post holes. So we have to be very careful. We have to be very careful when we pop back things like stones and posts into holes, because we often don't have enough information to know exactly what some of those holes were used for. Now, we can situate the site within its broader landscape. It's down here, and if we project out that axis at 44 degrees, it takes us nicely out into the landscape and, broadly speaking, divides up an area to the west, where there are quite a lot of barrows in this period and other cemeteries, and to the east, where there are certainly settlements and occupation along the Avon Valley that we have over here, and already in existence, of course, is the Stonehenge cursus to the north of Stonehenge and its great long barrow at its eastern end, Amesbury 42 long barrow. So we've got lots of things going on there. This phase of Stonehenge, and it is merely one phase of Stonehenge, comes to an end soon after 2000, or around about 2600 BC. And they start remodeling the site at this point. And when they remodel the site, they change the axis of the monument. They change the axis by about 5 degrees from the old alignment here, which went through the entranceway, to the new alignment here. That new alignment is, of course, on the solstices, towards the summer solstice rising sun to the northeast and the winter solstice setting sun towards the southwest. And that is the axis which is embedded in Stonehenge Phase 2 onwards, and which informs the way that the stone circles were put up and built. There is absolutely nothing at Stonehenge which says anything about a lunar orientation. Clive Ruggles has explored this extremely thoroughly, and there is no convincing lunar alignments. And the reason for that will become clear, I think, in just a moment. The people who built Stonehenge had no interest in the moon. The people who built the earthwork enclosure probably did, but the people who built the stone structures pretty much certainly didn't, for reasons which you'll see in just a moment. This change of axis, though, is something that we do see at a number of other monuments, and contemporary monuments happening. This change is happening at the same time elsewhere. So here's Dorchester-on-Thames, for example, another one of these wonderful ceremonial complexes, just like Stonehenge and Amesbury. And Dorchester has got henge, you can see it down here, and most importantly, it's got this very substantial cursus monument. And Richard Bradley has spent a lot of time working on the understanding of Dorchester-on-Thames, and he's been involved in quite a lot of the excavations there. And there's a quotation from him here. The shift, just to preempt what's coming, is from a lunar event towards a solar event. And that shift is incredibly important. Bradley says there is a danger of self-deception in this line of argument, though, but this evidence could form part of a wider pattern. It seems possible that during the mid-3rd millennium BC, southern England saw a significant change in ideology, from beliefs that centered on the moon to a greater concern for the sun. He said this back in 1988, and it turns out he was absolutely spot on from the evidence which has accumulated since that time. And this swing from a lunar interest to a solar interest in the middle part of the 3rd millennium BC, around about 2600, is represented in so many of our monuments of this period. And it just reminds us, and emphasizes perhaps, that when we're thinking about these sites, we have to recognize that they are not fixed. They're very fluid in the way that they develop, and they're very susceptible to being influenced and changed by the thinking of those communities who build them and use them at the time. And in this sense, there is no single prehistoric or ancient cosmology. What there is a whole series of successive cosmologies which emphasize or foreground particular aspects of human existence, particular relationships with the sky, particular aspects of the landscape. They draw out, if you like, the themes which are significant to them, and they embed those themes and those ideas in the monuments that they're constructing and using at that time. So this shift is quite important, and we'll see more of it as we go on, but it affects Stonehenge in quite a considerable way. After it ceases to be a burial place, it becomes the venue for the construction of this rather wonderful stone circle that we see and which we know and love today, and which has still come down to us after all these years. You see a reconstruction of it here with its sarsen stones, sarsen circle, its trilithon horseshoe. It's got the altar stone in this phase in the middle. It's got a series of blue stones around the outside in this particular configuration. It's got 4 stones out here, which are known as the station stones. It's got some stones here, which I must admit we know very little about, and which I'll come back to a little bit later on, because they could be rather more important than perhaps they first seem. But this arrangement is pretty nice, pretty unique, in fact, and it embeds within it, as I've already indicated, this solstitial alignment. It runs right through the center of the monument, through the center of the horseshoe, through the arrangement of the trilithons, and it's marked on the periphery by some of the peripheral stones out here to the northeast. That is the principal axis. There is no other certain major axis at Stonehenge. Tim Drew has made the really interesting observation that there may be a secondary axis represented by the exact alignment of the southwestern trilithon. And he makes a very convincing case for this, I think. And it's right, I think, that this axis should be represented on a smaller scale, because the axis that it represents is the opposite bits of the solstitial arrangement. So we have the midwinter sunrise down here towards the southeast, and we have the midsummer sunset up there towards the northwest. And that together gives us the 4 key points of the solstitial rose: the rising and setting of the sun at its maximum points on the horizon, and the setting points in exactly the same kind of way. What this gives us, of course, is an angle of approximately 80 degrees between these 2 axes running through the monument. Now, this is really important. Stonehenge was not built on the latitude that it is because that latitude had any significance at all. Stonehenge is built to reflect the astronomical events on the latitude at which it is constructed. It's the other way round. They knew if they built on this field, that's the angles that they needed to put into their monument. We can test this idea, and those of you who've been to the British Museum exhibition and looked at the Nebra sun disk from Germany will know exactly why I'm making this point, because the Nebra sun disk is not 80 degrees, it's 81 degrees. And the reason is the Nebra sun disk works in southern Germany, but it won't work on Salisbury Plain. You build your monument to fit the skyscape at the point you're building it. So whilst it's true that you couldn't build Stonehenge as it is anywhere else, the only reason for that is that they had to make it like that to be Stonehenge. So the place is critically important to the architectural design which comes from it. If we just project out into the landscape, we can see that that principal and secondary axis creates some quite interesting arrangements out into the landscape, particularly here where it cuts the cursors. Now here we've got to just think again a little bit about sequence. The Cursus is not a single phase monument. The Cursus was built probably about 3,600 or so BC, but it was recut. The earthworks of the Cursus were recut between 2,800 and 2,400 BC. The same sort of time as they're starting to mess around with Stonehenge and build the stone circle in the middle. Its recut doesn't exactly follow the line of the original ditches. There are slight variations, not huge, but there are slight variations within it. And so the arrangement of the landscape in relation to some of these axes and the projection out of these axes takes into account some of the things which are happening in the monuments around about. This is why we have to recognize and have to try and understand, as best we can at least, the minute sequential development of structures like the cursus, of structures like Stonehenge. And the same applies to some of the other things, because out there in the landscape there is some really important monuments, of which this one up here at Darrington Walls is one that's been in the news quite a lot these days. I think Mike Parker Pearson's work has come to the understanding that the earthwork at Darrington Walls is the last thing to be constructed. It encloses all the stuff that had been happening there for 5 or 6 or more centuries beforehand. The earthwork construction at Stonehenge and the earthwork construction at Darrington Walls, sorry, let me get that right. The earthwork construction at Darrington Walls and the stone construction at Stonehenge are, broadly speaking, contemporary. The occupation at Darrington Walls and the use of Stonehenge as a cemetery are broadly contemporary. So these sequences need to be kind of brought into coincidence. Just keep in your mind that earthwork construction for a second. There's one other thing, of course, which isn't on this diagram, and that is that there is an avenue added to Stonehenge, which, broadly speaking, runs down there, and that's added between about 2250 and 2100 or so BC. What is important to get here is that what we're trying to look at is not just the phasing of these things, but the exact synchronicity of what was going on in the landscape, because we have the capability now with high-resolution radiocarbon dating of seeing things which are actually within a single person's lifetime. What we need to know is how many generations there are between these phases in monuments. Could a person working on the building of one have been involved in the building of another? This is the level of resolution that we can start to look at this. Now, what all this, of course, takes us towards is that there is developing at this time, and we're talking now the period around about 2400 BC, a huge interest in solar events, in solar cosmologies. And there's something really behind this, because there's something really significant happening, not just in Britain, something happening in the world at this moment. 2600, 2400 is a crucial time. And the thing that's happening here is the rise of solar cults, and the spread of them across Europe. We can see this now in the ancient DNA evidence, which is showing us the movements, the migrations of people at this period. And what we have, importantly, is a large group of folks down here, known as Bellbika people. We've got a whole load of folks over here who are referred to as Cordedware people. We've got a whole group over here which are referred to as Yamnaya people. These are contemporaries. They're all in contemporary existence. And of course, they're all different, but they all have connections. They all join together in various ways. And this group, who originate down here, genetically speaking, migrate eastwards, and then they migrate northwards into the British Isles. And they are the people who are carrying with them the notion of a solar cult, the notion of a solar cosmology. And it effectively, just as they genetically replace the existing population in terms of their beliefs and understandings and cosmologies, they effectively replace those early lunar cosmologies with a whole set of solar cosmologies. And we can see it being played out in the material culture and in the way that they do things. So here's a celebrated case, the Amesbury Archer. I'm sure you all have seen this chap at some point or another. It's an adult male. We know from the evidence of the isotopes embedded in his teeth that he was born and brought up in his early years somewhere in the Alps, and that he spent his teenage years and later life in the chalklands of southern England. We all have, just in case you're worried, we all have embedded in our teeth a geochemical record of where we've lived over the years, because the chemistry of the water that we drank at that time embeds signatures into the enamel in our teeth. So it's a relatively simple process to just look through the growth rings, if you like, in the teeth. It's a bit more complicated than that in reality, but we can look at our own growth rings and see what's been going on. This is something which, as I say, the British Museum's exhibition has really focused our attention on, and indeed the first thing you kind of notice when you go into that exhibition is a sun, which is shining at you from the far end of the gallery. And it's embedded in what we see of the Amesbury Archer. We've got here, on the side of the screen, these two gold objects. There's a considerable amount of debate about these gold objects. Sometimes they're referred to as earrings. Basket earrings, I've even seen said in the literature. They're not basket earrings. I've heard them referred to as hair tresses, that you could, plait your hair or gather your hair together into some sort of ponytail or something and put one of these on and it would hold it. That would work, but it's not that either. These are actually objects which are quite well recognized, which have been ritually killed at the time of their burial by being rolled up. And when you unroll them, here they are rolled up at the top. Can you see it on the corner of the picture? I should have put this a bit bigger. You see them rolled up here, and here you see them opened out. They're little badges. They're sun discs. They're to tell you that I'm in the sun cult, man. They're little badges, like a lapel badge today. And we find similar things over quite wide areas. In fact, probably the quest for gold in Europe at this time is all about developing this great interest in solar cults and pursuing it through various material culture. And we can see it very clearly in some of the objects that come through, contemporary with Stonehenge in its original construction, and then over the centuries that follow as it's modified and changed and falls into use. There's a nice stone example there on the far left-hand side here, from Denmark, which is a little bit earlier than some, but here's three very nice ones from the British Isles, two from Ireland, one from Wales, one from Ireland, one from England. And they're gold sun discs. They're, again, you can see they've got little holes in the middle. You tie them on or sew them onto your clothing to show that you're there. It's a bit like a pilgrim's badge, I suppose, from more recent times. But you'll also notice that the crosses on them are not exactly 90 degrees. The crosses on them, of course, reflect the places where the sun has its two principal and secondary axes on the solstices, and this kind of fits in with what we've got here. Once they start on solar cosmologies, they get a bit carried away, it's fair to say, and the material culture of getting a bit carried away involves these quite extraordinary things, which are known as lunarly, which is quite the wrong word to describe them. These are sun collars. And when you put one on, the person who's wearing it literally has their head in the sun, as you see from the example here. This is the sun god. This is the son of the sun. This is the person who is the incarnation of the sun on earth. Maybe some of those statements sound a bit familiar from other religions, but these are the sorts of things which are going on here. Individuals are being picked out and related to the center, not just of the cosmos, but the center of the world, the center of their society, the center of their thinking, which is a solar cosmology. Now we have to kind of ask ourselves in a way, what's this all about? There are lots of different cosmologies. There's no single ancient cosmology in Britain. There's many cosmologies which have followed on from one another over the course of time. They've replaced each other, but of course, like any situation in a social situation, as they replace each other, they don't get lost, they simply get hidden. And in any society, there's always countercultures of various sorts. There's a dominant culture and a counterculture of some sort, or maybe many countercultures, and they sometimes, if you like, keep the flame of earlier cosmologies or alternative belief systems alive. So although there is a succession of cosmologies, there is also a plurality of cosmologies. At any one time, you'll find people in the past looking at the world in different ways, thinking about the world in different ways. And what are these cosmologies all about? They're all about how we structure the universe and the place of us, the people, inside it. How do we relate to the sky? How do we relate to the landscape? How do we relate to the things that we can see going on? The movements of the sky, the movements of the heavenly bodies, the water, the earth, sea, fire, clouds, everything. How do we relate to them? And human beings, perhaps you might even argue the thing that distinguishes human beings, is the ability to make up these incredibly complicated stories about the relationship between us as ourselves and the world in which we live. And to make up those stories, we play with numbers, we play with patterns, we play with regularities, we play with all sorts of things to make sense of the world in which we live in. And for that, of course, we then develop and give meaning to a whole series of myths, of which every society has some sort of creation myth. We can obviously relate to those which we know of from the modern world. If you have a look in the early chapters of the Bible, you'll find two conflicting creation myths, one of which is that human beings were created just like that on the sixth day, and the other, a couple of pages on, is of course that human beings were made out of clay, taken from the earth, and that having made a male, God then made a female. There's different ways of looking at our creation myths. Do any of those relate back to the Neolithic? Well, maybe. Another lecture for another day, perhaps. People have to account for themselves in terms of their descent from their ancestors. Sometimes those ancestors are mythical beings, sometimes they're physical beings, sometimes they're animals or rocks or plants, all sorts of other things are in there too. And this is what we have to look for in prehistory. Where do people trace their ancestry to? And as part of that, we have to establish relationships between ourselves, the people, and other elements, the things that are around us, what is threatening, what is life-sustaining, what provides us with well-being, what is our enemy, how does it work? And typically, of course, we have to justify that cycle of birth, life, and death, either as a linearity or as a cycle, or any of the other options in between. And somewhere in there, too, is the need to kind of map the passage of time. The passage of time and people's relationship to it. And that is where we come to the notion of a calendar of some sort of regularity, some sort of agreed way of thinking about how the world unfolds in terms of time. Now, over the years, there's been many, many attempts to create a calendar for Stonehenge. It's probably one of the few things that people agree on about Stonehenge, and that is that somewhere in it is a calendar. The snag is that nobody's really found one that works. We could go on all day about people who have tried, but I've picked out three, which are probably fairly familiar to you. Back in the early 20th century, Norman Lockyer, a famous astronomer, concluded that there was at Stonehenge a kind of a May calendar, and that it was somehow based on what he referred to as clock stars, although he never actually told us which stars were involved, or indeed quite how it worked. It was a nice throwaway idea, but you couldn't actually make it work on the ground, as it were. You couldn't go there and say, this is the day I'm standing in now, on the basis of Lockyer's clock. The same applies to Gerald Hawkins, great doyen of the Neolithic computer, of course. He thought there was a time reckoning system there based on or a time reckoning system which was there in order to predict eclipses at the site, and he worked out some very complicated systems, you remember, about moving stones around in different holes and sockets and all sorts of things around the place, and yeah, you could get it to work, I suppose. And then there was Alexander Thom. We've heard about him several times over the weekend. He suggested there was a 16-month calendar based on the solstices and the equinoxes and May Lammas celebrations and the Martinmas Candlemas celebrations as turning points in what's, generally speaking, called a Celtic calendar. All these are nice ideas. All of them, as I said to you, you can't actually go to the site and make them work. You can't go there and say, this is the day that I'm now standing here. But all of them fail for other reasons too, and there's a number of key reasons why they fail. The first, and I'm afraid Gerald Hawkins fell into this rather deeply, is that you can't use non-contemporaneous elements of the site in constructing your calendar. Things which weren't there yet can't be brought forward in time, and things which have been abandoned can't be, as it were, carried over into later phases. We have to recognize the integrity and chronology of the site. You can't just arbitrarily use bits that happen to fit your model. The second is that many people, and I think Lockyer might have been a candidate here, tried to make the thing way, way too complicated. They tried to embed lunar and solar and stellar and all sorts of other things together in the kind of hope that the more you added, the more interesting it would be. In general, in prehistory, the more you add, the more you make it complicated, the less likely it is to be true. If you can do it with a piece of string and a stick, that's probably what happened in the Neolithic. You don't need these kind of great overarching complexities. And the third reason why some of these are wrong, and this applies to Tom's theory, is of course the work that Ronald Hutton has done, which has effectively discredited the entire notion of the so-called Celtic calendar as a 19th century academic dream, which was brought together from all sorts of strange sources. And Ronald's done a fantastic job, almost like a forensic scientist, in unpicking the various lines of inquiry that were brought together to make that, and has just shredded it. So we have to kind of put that one to one side as well. We're left, I guess, with a bit of a void at the end of that. It's easy to demolish stuff. It's more difficult to put things together. But as I said at the beginning, the opportunity to go there quite a lot during lockdown and do some research, which I was already pursuing and was able to get there during the day, led one to be able to sit there a bit longer than normal and to be able to contemplate some of these things a bit more. And it became apparent to me during lockdown that actually there was some very simple things going on at Stonehenge which we hadn't really spotted before. I'm leaving aside for a moment the blue stones. I said a bit about those yesterday, but I'm not going to mention them again this afternoon. We're focusing here on the sarsen stones. And what got me thinking about the sarsen stones was the work that I was doing at the time with David Nash to try and work out where the sarsen stones came from. We were very successful at that, or David was very successful at that, in pinpointing the source of all but two of them to West Woods, just near Marlborough. We know from the dating evidence that the sarsens are all put up at more or less the same time, in stage 2, when they first put this stone monument in the middle. And the integrity of the sources, together with the integrity of the dating, suggests that we need to see the sarsens as an ensemble, as a collection of elements which must have fitted together in some way, because they were put up together from the same sources of stone at the same time. So they must have had some sort of meaning together to the people involved in doing it. And there's some sort of obvious numbers in amongst this, which, as I was contemplating it, kind of made sense in terms of a calendar. And the numbers are pretty straightforward. There's 30 uprights, and although there's not 30 preserved on the site today, we do know either from earlier excavations or from parch marks and things that there were 30 there originally, and we know, broadly speaking, the sizes of them, and we know that there were also 30 lintels joining those up at the top, and you can see that from the interfacing joints which are preserved. So even where there's a lintel missing, you can see that the joint on the adjacent stone means that there must have been one in the gap. We can be pretty confident that there were 30 uprights and 30 lintels across the top. And then we've got 5 trilithons in the centre, 5 great trilithons. 3 of them are still standing, 2 of them have fallen. All of the stones of the trilithons are still there. And then around the outside, we've got 4 station stones, which are smaller. They're not dressed, but 2 of them survive, 2 of them, I'm afraid to say, are missing. That combination of 30 plus 5 plus 4 gives one a fairly obvious calendrical set of numbers. The sarsen circle of 30 uprights gives you 12 months perhaps, 12 cycles if you like, of 30 days each, 360 days. 5 trilithons gives you an intercalary month of 5 days, and 4 station stones gives you the quarter days to provide the basis for a perpetual solar calendar, which is based on the tropical year. The question is, where do you start your tropical year and where do you end it? A tropical year is simply 12 solar months between 2 significant events. The obvious event in terms of Stonehenge is the midwinter solstice. That's what the entire monument is focused upon, and which is observational in the sense that if you stand inside the circle and look to the southwest at approximately the time of the solstice, you can record the solstice itself by the setting sun in the crack, if you like, in the gap between the 2 uprights of the southwestern trilithon. So this a bit of in a sense, observational astronomy is what comes into play here. In that sense, it's pretty straightforward. It's a solar calendar, and it has the slight and nice advantage that you can actually fiddle with it and adjust it on the winter solstice if you wanted to. You could get it kind of right at that time. So these are the kind of basics, but we can look in a bit more detail because there's some other features which are worth thinking about too. One of them is that the stones are not all the same size around the circle. Now, there are a few missing, so we have to be a bit careful of that. Luckily, some of those that are missing either have holes, stone holes, sockets, which have been excavated, so we know something of their size, or we have, more recently, parch marks in the ground, which again give an indication, although not a precise indication, of their size too. But there's two stones which stand out. Stone 11 and stone 21 on the circle are quite different from any of the other stones in the circle, and they're marked here on this diagram, which show you the stones. The dark brown are where we know the width, the light brown is where we have estimated the widths, and then we've got the gaps, which are in blue. Again, the dark blue is where we know it, the light blue is where we are not so certain about it, but these two stones here and the gaps adjacent to them stand out in the pattern as we can currently see it. Here they are. Stone 11 is this strange little thing over here. A number of people, including our last speaker, and I have to accept that I've fallen into this trap myself in the past, have imagined that this stone is somehow a way of thinking of a lunar calendar and seeing it as a half stone. I'm afraid I'm wrong, everybody else is wrong at the same time, because it's not a half stone, it's been cut off at the top. It used to stand the same height as all the others. It is a narrower stone, however, that's absolutely right, but so too is stone 21, which is over here, next to stone 22, and I think if you see 22 and 10, and compare 11 with 10 and 21 with 22, you can see what we're talking about here. These are quite different in their form. They're also in interesting positions. Stone 11 and stone 21 represent the points of change if you were to allow there to be 3 weeks of 10 days each on that cycle of 30 uprights. A week of 10 days, 3 such weeks, giving you a month of 30 days. Seems to be quite a nice sort of little pattern that goes on there. If we put those together and add to it the solstitial alignment, this is the actual monument here with the solstitial alignment going through. This is a reconstruction of it here with the different days going around it. We can see that this also creates, quite interestingly, a year of 2 halves. A winter season, if you like, and a summer season, perhaps. You can give names and things to these, if you like. And if we just focus in a little bit more, we can see how this would work. This is the solstitial alignment. Here's our months, and within the months here we've got days. This is a notional representation of it. In this scheme, month 1, day 1, would be the 3rd day after the winter solstice, which is when the sun begins to be visibly moving in the window of sight in that trilithon. So it's a bit of observational astronomy. This would be, in general terms, although it does vary year on year, this would be usually 23rd or 24th of December in the proleptic Gregorian calendar that we use today. Interesting date, probably stolen by the Christians. Thus, the full year, in that sense, would have these 2 halves. We'd have, as I say, a sort of spring and summer, and autumn and winter, which would go together, and that fits. Once you've started your cycles, you simply go around 30 times, and then you come back to your 5 extra days, which are marked by those sarsens in the middle. We can think about these things in all sorts of ways, and they do kind of make a bit of sense. Let's say we don't know, of course, the names of any of the months, or indeed any of the days. It would be nice to think that the months could be named after, for example, the zodiac eras, and it's interesting, those of you who know about such things, that of course the zodiac months start on the 22nd or 23rd of our modern Gregorian calendar months. That's actually the prehistoric start of the month. be interesting if anyone who is expert in these areas would have a thought on the additional month. That's quite important, the ceremonial month. We might also wonder about the days of the week. Hard, isn't it? I would guess that they're called Moon Day, Sunday, Saturn Day, and so on. You need 10, you can work them out. Not difficult. And then we need to think about those big trilithons in the middle. What are they? Since the 19th century, people have said perhaps those are deities of some sort, and I kind of quite like that idea. What they didn't know in the 19th century is that the key deities which relate to this rise of the solar cult in the mid-3rd millennium BC are generally regarded as the divine twins. The divine twins, for example, Castor and Pollux, Apollo and Artemis, these kind of things. If you had to represent the divine twins, what would you do? Well, in prehistory, they generally represented them as pairs of objects which were not identical but very nearly so. Here at Stonehenge, we've got two uprights which are nearly identical but not exactly so. Maybe that's the sort of thing that we're seeing there. You might reasonably ask, what's today then? We can work it out. You can go to Stonehenge, and you don't even have to go to Stonehenge. You get your diary out, and you can work it out. The last Neolithic New Year's Day was the 23rd of December last year. That just happens to be when the solstice fell out. So we are now in month 5, day 14 of the Neolithic calendar. If I knew the names of the months and days, I'd tell you which it was, but that's it. We can calculate exactly where we are in the Stonehenge calendar at any time. We can work it out. You might reasonably also ask, what about the months? Why aren't they marked? You might say, well, in that case, how many markers do you need? If we accept the year as in 2 halves, we'd be looking for 6 markers. There's no group of stones in the centre of the monument which seem to fit the bill. There's no group of stones which is either 12 or 6. But there are some stones on the edge of the site, if you like, the edge of the enclosure, around where the entrance is, around where the avenue comes into Stonehenge. The snag is, well, there's a number of snags. One is this area hasn't been very fully excavated. So all we're looking at is the holes which happen to be within the excavation trenches. There's most likely other holes in unexcavated areas, but we don't, I'm afraid, know about those. And these holes are incredibly badly dated. We just have very, very little information. In fact, when Mike Parker Pearce and myself were working on the chronology for Stonehenge, we couldn't find any dating material that we could actually use from these holes. And I'm not personally at the moment prepared to accept them until we know that they date to the right period. They haven't all got stones in, but I've marked them here on the plan just to help you. There's 3 here, there's a couple here, and there's a couple here. It's even possible that not all of them are stone holes. They're excavated a long time ago in some cases, and there are alternative explanations for them. The axis, the solstitial axis, runs through at that sort of a line. You could find yourself 6 stones there if you wanted to. I'm not going to do it because I'm not convinced that we know enough about the detail of the archaeology to do that. But if you want to find 6 stones there, you can, and you can call them the months if you wish. But for the moment, I'm going to leave that to one side. But we do have a few other interesting lines of support for this kind of notion of a year which was divided broadly into 2 parts, which had the kind of characteristics that we've just been talking about. Jim Mallory and Douglas Adams, for example, have reconstructed the so-called Proto-Indo-European Lexicon of words, those words which stand behind all of the languages which we know of in the Indo-European language family. In more recent times, they think this language was being, the words would be familiar to languages which were being spoken in the 3rd millennium BC. There are words for the whole year. I've got them set out here. But in general, there's 2 sets of words suggesting that there are 2 parts to a year, a full year and a partial year, a new season or a new time, as it were. That needs a little bit of unpicking. There's 4 words which relate to summer, spring, autumn, and winter. Those are reconstructible in that system of thinking as well. We've also got another interesting little piece on the side, and that is that the Venerable Bede, when he was working on the Christian calendar that we now use, broadly speaking, use, he created a chapter talking about the calendar that existed beforehand and in effect what he was going to change to make it fall in line with the needs of the Christian church. And he set it out in this book, The Reckoning of Time, which was written about AD 725. And in it, he describes very nicely the pre-Christian New Year at the Festival of Yule, which is, of course, the winter solstice, and the summer festival of Litha, which is at the summer solstice. And he notes how in traditional ways of thinking in Britain at the time he was writing, the year was divided into two halves. He was probably hearing an echo of what was going on in prehistory. May not have been identical, but at least an echo of what was going on. Which begs us the question, in a sense, of why you make a calendar in the first place. Why do you need a calendar? We've kind of assumed that a little bit in what we've been talking about over the last few minutes. So many books will tell you that you need a calendar to know when to plant your seeds or to harvest your crops, but as any of you who are farmers will know, no self-respecting farmer needs to be told when to sow and when to harvest. That's pretty obvious from their experience and understanding of the land. What the farmer does need to be told, however, is when the harvest festival is, when they need to bring along the produce to give to the gods, because that's a propitious moment. That's a key element. That's a festival. And the God tells you that, not nature. So carrying out the routine of life to please the gods, to be present at their key, if you like, calendarized festivals and ceremonies is pretty important. Creating a calendar is the way that political elites legitimize power, of course. This is entirely typical. We often find the line, who makes time makes power, and that's a very important part of control over populations and how things go on. It also, of course, gives physical substance to those conceptual cosmologies that we talked about earlier on, structuring behaviors, structuring relationships, sorting out how people do things, when they do things, why they do things, and so on. It kind of brings communities closer to their gods, ensuring that events happen at propitious moments. And one of the reasons that a clock or a calendar is made in early times is for healing rituals. For example, the early Greek calendar is all about the healing rituals at the shrine of Apollo, and what goes on there is conditioned by the calendar, and indeed when Apollo is in residence is conditioned by the calendar as well. That's at Delphi. And it also, of course, helps communities to make, mark, keep pace with time. Not that everybody follows it exactly, as we all know, but we have at least a structure within which we operate. So with these kind of thoughts in mind, we've, I suppose, also got to ask ourselves, where did this idea come from? Not the idea for me, but perhaps the idea of what's going on. Can we see some connectivity here? What are the origins of a solar calendar? And the first place we need to think is, was it an indigenous development? Were people building this kind of calendar here in Britain in the mid-3rd millennium BC? And it's certainly possible. It is certainly possible. Already by that time, the winter solstice was being celebrated, or embedded at least, in some of the monuments, sites which are very familiar to you, I'm sure. Newgrange, for example, in Ireland with the sunrise, winter solstice sunrise, and at Maeshowe, the winter solstice sunset. These are passage graves. They were built soon after 3000, or around 3000 BC. But there is a snag with these. We celebrate Newgrange, we celebrate Maeshowe, but these are just 2 or 3 sites within a population of several hundred, and all the others don't. They don't have a solstitial alignment in them. So it may be that these particular sites just happen to have a solstitial alignment in them because the alignment or the orientation of their chambers is following some other rule. I'll just give you an example. What about your birthdays? Everybody's got a birthday. The sun rises at a certain point on the horizon on your birthday, and you may say that's a significant point on the horizon for you. 1 or 2 of you, hands up, anyone who's got a birthday on the solstice, either summer or winter? For me, the sunrise on the winter solstice is a birthday celebration. The sunrise on your birthday is a birthday celebration, but not a solstice celebration. So we need just to think carefully about how some of these things work. It's easy to pick out the nice bits and forget others. However, after about 2000 BC, A lot of the monuments which are constructed, unlike those constructed earlier, a lot of them do embed solstitial alignments. I'll just give you one example to underline the point, but there are quite a few. These are the Clava cairns up in Inverness, built just soon after 2000 BC, and there's a whole series of them. They have a winter solstice alignment. This one here, if you look out through the chamber, that's where you see the sunset, and if you look out through this one, that's the picture, the sun sets into this mound. So there is some structure going on there. But indigenous developments are not the only possibility. We know from archaeological work, especially in relation to ancient DNA, for example, and into isotope studies, the Amesbury Archer was a case in point, that people were moving about, both individually and as whole communities through migrations and movements of populations in the 3rd millennium BC, in other words, at this exact same time. So we need to just put this map back on and remind ourselves that the map was rubbish, because the map was only about Europe. What about the things that are going on in Greece, or the Mediterranean, or Mesopotamia, or Egypt at the same time? Why couldn't people who were living in southern Britain know about what was happening in southeastern Europe, or the Mediterranean, or beyond? People like the Amesbury Archer moved during the course of their lifetime these kind of distances. They carried memories and understandings and thinking about things. So we mustn't be too insular about this. We've got to think broad and wide, and it's a criticism of many of my archaeological colleagues that our maps are never big enough when we draw these things out. There's a very interesting thing that happened. You've spotted it on the side of the screen already. Around about 2650 or so BC, in Egypt, they were developing what became known as the civil calendar. They developed it because the lunar calendar they'd been using up until that time was rubbish. They couldn't make it work. And it is very difficult to make a lunar calendar work. You can sort of do it, but it's very difficult. So they developed this solar calendar, which was part of the development of what we now know as early dynastic society in Egypt. It predates the construction of the pyramids, but only by a little bit, and we get pyramids coming in at the start of the Old Kingdom before very long. Now, maybe, and I'm only putting it as a maybe this Egyptian calendar, the civil calendar, was part of this movement of interest in solar cults during the 3rd millennium BC. It developed around about 2700, this calendar, 2650 perhaps. It was heavily influenced by what was going on in Mesopotamia. Egypt and Mesopotamia were in close contact at this time. It was a solar calendar based on 365 solar days, 12 months into 30 days. The months, in this case, were named after festivals and zodiac, which is why I suggested maybe we should use that here. There were 3 weeks, each of 10 days. We don't know the name of the days, unfortunately. And there was an intercalary month of 5 days with these 5 epigonomial days, which are the names of the birthdays of the gods: Osiris, Horus, Isis, Set, and Nephesis. These were the big gods of the time. They thought of it as having 3 seasons. There's a lot of debate in the literature about the Egyptian calendar as to whether they knew and understood and did anything about the leap year. Some scholars think they did, some think they didn't. Jury's out, I think, on that, but it's certainly a possibility that they understood. I think most people agree they understood it. It's a question of whether they applied it. In their case, the new year was represented by the reappearance of Sirius at the start of the Nile floods in the late summer kind of period. So it's interesting. There's some very interesting correspondence, if you like, between the sort of thing that we could reconstruct at Stonehenge and the sort of thing that we can see here down in Egypt. You might reasonably ask whether there are circles in Egypt, and it's fair to say that most of the architecture from the Old Kingdom onwards doesn't involve circles particularly, although there are circles. You see one here at Nabta Playa, which is, the dating of which is a bit obscure, it's fair to say. But the circle is very much a part of their symbolized system of depicting the world at this time. There's 2 pictures there. You can see the circle here. It's the sun on people's heads. And here's the circle here too. It's the sun. And if you look very carefully on that one, it's got the cross arrangement in the center as well. The circle and the cross and the arrangement of the solstices is very much there. Stonehenge is unique. There's nothing like Stonehenge in the northwest of Europe, and many of its features, its architectural features, are features which you will only find in Egypt at this time, that is the mid-3rd millennium BC. So this kind of upright and lintel construction, here you see it in an Egyptian context. These joints, please don't tell me they're mortise and tenon joints, they're not. They're stub mortise joints. It's a very specific type of joint which you use in stoneworking, and we find these in Egypt too. They're not mortise and tenon, they're stub mortise. And this notion of entasis, which is the way that you shape the stones so that they look more parallel when you stand back a little bit. And again, this is an architectural device which we only find in Egypt in the mid-3rd millennium BC. Many other societies have it later, but at around 2500, 2600, that's the only place that we find it. So there's some interesting, in a sense, connections perhaps in the structure and form of Stonehenge and what's going on in Egypt at the same sort of time. And this is why getting our time frames right is pretty important. 100 years ago, nobody would have quibbled about the statement that Stonehenge could have been based upon some things which are going on in Egypt. That was taken as read at the time. We've gone through a period when, for all sorts of reasons that there's no time to talk about today, but all sorts of reasons we've moved away from that kind of position. But actually, we're moving back towards it. At one time, people thought there was a direct link between Mycenae down here in Greece and Stonehenge up here in southern Britain. We now know that that's not correct at all. Mycenae is much younger than Stonehenge, so that's why there's a dotted line on there. There is no connection between those two things directly, but there is a whole series of what you might call sort of leapfrog relationships between what's going on down here and what's going on up here. And some of these arrows just indicate the sort of relationships. What we're talking about here is probably people moving over considerable distances, but trends, traditions, knowledge, including material culture, actually only moving certain distances. But the stuff from Egypt, which gets into Crete, for example, scarab ornaments, stone vessels, all these kind of things, we know that. It also gets up here into Corsica and a little bit into southern Greece, perhaps. But stuff from Greece then gets up into Central Europe, and some of it gets up perhaps into Britain. Stuff from Northern Europe gets down into Greece. So we've got all sorts of things moving about. I'll show you just three things which help us understand this. The real problem is dating some of this. One that we know starts pretty early is amber. And amber from the Baltic, up here, gets down into Greece during the early Bronze Age for sure. It gets across into Britain well before Stonehenge starts to be built, a century or two before Stonehenge begins to be built. And at the time of Stonehenge and in the centuries of the first part of the second millennium BC, amber is very, very common. You can see here some of the typical amber objects from the early second millennium BC, and here's a map showing us the fine spots in this part of northern Europe, the exact fine spots, and you'll see there's a major cluster of this stuff around Stonehenge. So amber might be one of the, if you like, sort of ghost traces of some really big exchanges and movements of people. Another one is this little curious object, this one here, which was found with the Boscombe Bowmen, which is a group of beaker burials at just near Amesbury. It dates to the period 2500 to 2300, so it's perfect for the sort of time that Stonehenge is being built. And it's a type of object, we've no idea what it is. People think it's a piece of clothing, which we find all the way down through Central Europe and right down into Greece as well. There's a second one from Britain, which is from Cambridgeshire, from this barrow at Barnack, and it's more or less the same sort of date. So we've got a few little bits and pieces which are suggesting that there's some important things, and they may be clothes rather than objects, which are moving about over quite a great distance. Once we get into the early second millennium BC, though, this is third millennium BC, but once we get into the early second millennium BC, it's a no-brainer. We've got stuff moving about between the Mediterranean and southern Britain at that time, and probably the most celebrated object is this, which is a glass bead found in this barrow here, just to the south of Stonehenge. If the picture was better, Stonehenge would be on the horizon over there. It was found in barrow G42. And technical analysis of the glass, it's a glass bead, shows that it was made in the Levant, in the eastern Mediterranean, and has got here sometime very soon after 2000 BC, perhaps. So we've got actual things, we've got surrogate things, and we've got, as it were, the sound of other things moving around as well. And I think this is just scratching the surface. We've got to revisit some of the objects which take us back to these kind of relationships. We can push it back to about 2000 BC with no problem at all. The gap at the moment is between about 2000 and 2500 or so. That's what the pendants seem to fit into, what the amber fits into, but we need to tie it down a little bit further. Now, there's lots more things that we could talk about, but I just want to finish by picking up one other facet. And that's an old friend of everybody, I suppose. Our old friend Geoffrey of Monmouth, the monk who wrote the history of kings of Britain, the monk who made up most of what he wrote, drawing on the oral histories and oral traditions and things that he knew about. Stonehenge is pretty much the only ancient monument that he describes in that book, so it must have been quite important to him for that reason. And as you all know, he weaves a story around Stonehenge involving Merlin the wizard and all sorts of things. Send for the Giant's Ring, which is on Mount Calaris in Ireland. Those stones are connected with certain secret religious rites and have various properties which are medicinally important. Many years ago, he goes on to say, the giants transported them from the remotest confines of Africa and set them up in Ireland at a time when they inhabited that country. Now, Geoffrey made up some of this stuff with oral tradition in the background. There's a lot of stuff being mixed and matched and confused, and no doubt Geoffrey was very confused himself, but wouldn't you be sitting in a monastery in South Wales in the 12th century trying to write about things in prehistory? I think we all would be a bit confused. There's all sorts of strands coming in here, but any notion that this is a story only about bluestones, and that's an assumption, of course, and the connection between bluestones and Wales, well, Ireland is near enough, isn't it? Maybe we need to think about the Sarsens too. Maybe he was conflating the different kinds of stones. But if we follow the trail that he's put down here, there's an African link which links to the west of Britain, Ireland, and that links back to Stonehenge. He's confused, and perhaps compacted various things together here. So maybe in that mythology, the mythology of Geoffrey of Monmouth, we can see something of a long-distance echo that some of these ideas come from a long way away. Africa in that sort of time would, of course, have been Egypt. So these are some thoughts. They're proposals. They're not conclusions, they're proposals as to what's going on here. We have to think about the function of Stonehenge. The calendar is not its primary function. The calendar is embedded in Stonehenge so that all sorts of other things can happen, so that people can make sense of the things that are happening and people can make sense of the universe around them in the sort of ways that we've been talking about this afternoon. You can have a read about some of these things. The calendar itself, as Hugh mentioned at the beginning, is published in Antiquity. It's a free-to-download open access paper. You can see the DOI there if you want to download it and have a look. And in the bookshop, there are some copies of my book, Stonehenge, A Biography of a Landscape, which trace some of those bigger patterns that we were talking about over the course of the last hour or so, which I hope will help you have a think about some of these things at Stonehenge. So thanks for listening, and keep thinking. Stonehenge is there to puzzle us.